The crystal glass didn't just fall, it seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat, refracting the opulence of the ballroom before it met the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot, slicing through the soft hum of violins and the arrogant laughter of the city's elite. Champagne splattered across the hand-stitched leather of Dante's shoes that cost more than most people in this room made in a year, but the most feared man in the tri-state area didn't even flinch. Dante, a man known for his icy composure and a gaze that could wither a seasoned hitman, was suddenly, visibly breaking. His fingers, usually steady enough to lead a surgical strike, began to tremble. A cold, prickling sweat broke out across his brow, matting his hair against his temples. He wasn't looking at the broken glass. He wasn't looking at the terrified socialite who had been flirting with him just moments before. His eyes were locked on a woman in a faded, oversized gray uniform, kneeling just 3 feet away. To everyone else, she was Maya, the invisible girl. The clumsy maid who had spent the evening being stepped on, ignored, and mocked for the stain on her apron. She was currently reaching for a shard of glass, her head bowed in a practiced gesture of subservience. But as she felt Dante's gaze, she paused. Slowly, with a grace that felt entirely out of place in a servant's uniform, she tilted her chin upward. When their eyes met, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Dante's breath hitched, a ragged, desperate sound that caught in the back of his throat. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps, a god he thought he had buried years ago. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a choked, panicked silence. The king of the underworld was staring at a girl with a cleaning rag as if she were a reaper standing at his door. The guests around them began to whisper, their mocking smiles faltering. They saw the terror on Dante's face, and for the first time, they looked at the maid not as trash to be discarded, but as a mystery they were suddenly, deathly afraid to solve. Why was the man who feared no one currently shaking like a leaf in front of the woman they had spent all night insulting? Maya didn't say a word. She simply offered a tiny, ghost of a smile that promised a reckoning. To understand the terror in Dante's eyes, you have to understand the 3 hours that led up to it, hours where Maya was treated as less than human. The gala at the Blackwood estate was a sea of shimmering silk, vintage bourbon, and the kind of laughter that sounds like breaking glass. In the center of this hurricane of vanity stood Maya, her presence scrubbed thin by a shapeless uniform that smelled of industrial lemon bleach. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, an invisible force whose only purpose was to ensure the comfort of people who didn't know her name. To the men in $5,000 tuxedos, she was merely a tray-bearer. To the women draped in diamonds, she was a moving obstacle. They spoke over her, their voices sharp and loud, discussing multi-million-dollar mergers and scandalous affairs as if she were a piece of the mahogany furniture, incapable of hearing or understanding. "Watch it, girl," a young heir snapped, barely glancing back as he stepped squarely onto Maya's foot. He didn't offer an apology, he didn't even break his sentence about his new yacht. He simply adjusted his stance, grinding his heel into her shoe before moving on. Maya didn't wince. She simply stepped back into the shadows of the velvet curtains, her expression a mask of perfect, chilling neutrality. The mistreatment was systematic, a casual sport for the bored and the wealthy. Every time Maya moved to clear a plate, a hand would intentionally shift a glass, making her reach further, testing her balance. They mocked her clumsiness when the crowded floor made it impossible to navigate, whispering loud enough for her to hear about the low-class help ruining the aesthetic of the evening. One woman, a prominent heiress with eyes like cold marbles, purposefully flicked her cigarette ash onto Maya's shoulder, watching with a smirk as the gray fabric scorched. "Oh, dear," the heiress cooed to her friends, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I thought she was a statue. She's so still." Perhaps if the help were a bit more animated, they'd be easier to avoid. The group erupted into high-pitched giggles. Maya simply reached up, brushed the ash from her shoulder with a steady hand, and bowed. It was a shallow bow, one that looked like submission but felt, to anyone actually paying attention, like a predator lowering its head before a strike. She was the ghost in the room, a woman who had spent the night collecting their secrets, observing their weaknesses, and absorbing their insults without a single tremor of emotion. They thought they were looking down at a servant, someone broken by the weight of poverty and labor. They had no idea that the woman they were treating like dirt was actually the one holding the map to all their graves. As she moved toward the kitchen to replenish her tray, she passed a mirror. For a split second, the maid disappeared. In the reflection, her eyes weren't those of a victim, they were dark, sharp, and ancient. She wasn't just enduring the gala. She was auditing it. And so far, every person in the room was deep in the red. The atmosphere in the ballroom had reached a fever pitch of arrogance, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the suffocating weight of unearned privilege. Juliana, the daughter of a real estate mogul whose ego far outstripped his net worth, watched Maya with the focused cruelty of a cat cornering a mouse. To Juliana, Maya wasn't just a servant, she was a convenient target for a bad mood that had been simmering since her arrival. As Maya navigated the narrow gap between a velvet divan and a gold-trimmed table, her arms balanced a tray of crystal flutes, Juliana saw her opening. With a deliberate, calculated movement, the socialite thrust out her designer stiletto. The trip was violent. Maya's boots caught the edge of the heel, and for a moment, gravity took over. The tray tilted, the flutes sliding with a rhythmic clinking before they tumbled. Two shattered against the floor, and the splash of vintage champagne darkened the hem of Juliana's silk gown. The music didn't stop, but the conversation in the immediate circle died a jagged death. "You clumsy, pathetic bitch." Juliana's scream was shrill, cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. She looked down at the small damp spot on her dress as if it were a mortal wound. "Do you have any idea what this costs? This dress is worth more than your entire bloodline." Maya was already on the floor, her knees pressing into the cold marble as she began to gather the shards. Her hands were steady, but Juliana wasn't finished. She wanted blood, or at least, total humiliation. She stepped closer, the sharp point of her heel inches from Maya's fingers. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, dirt," Juliana hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that carried to every ear in the vicinity. "You don't just get to clean this up and walk away. You've ruined my night. You've insulted this house." The socialite's friends gathered around, a wall of expensive fabric and mocking smiles. "She really is slow, isn't she?" one of them laughed, sipping from a glass Maya had likely polished an hour ago. "Maybe she needs a lesson in manners. People like her only understand one language." Juliana leaned down, her face inches from Maya's. "I want you to beg. Not just an apology. I want you to stay right there, on your knees, and tell me how sorry you are for being such a worthless, incompetent waste of space. Beg for my forgiveness, or I'll make sure you never find work in this city again, not even scrubbing toilets." The circle of wealthy onlookers leaned in, their eyes gleaming with the sick excitement of a public execution. They waited for the sob, the trembling voice, the sight of a broken woman pleading for her livelihood. They wanted to feel the rush of their own power reflected in her despair. But Maya didn't sob. She didn't look up with tear-filled eyes. She remained perfectly still, her hands hovering over the broken glass. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and uncomfortable. It was a silence that didn't belong to a victim. It was the silence of a timer counting down to 0. "I'm waiting," Juliana snapped, her face turning a mottled red. "Beg. Now." Maya's fingers closed around a long, sharp shard of crystal. She didn't grip it like a tool, she held it with the casual precision of someone who knew exactly where the carotid artery sat under a layer of expensive makeup. The rage in the room was palpable, but it was being met by something far colder. The expected sob never came. Instead, the air around Maya seemed to crystallize, turning brittle and cold. With a slow, fluid motion that defied the frantic energy of the crowd, she began to rise. She didn't scramble to her feet like a servant caught in a mistake, she ascended with the terrifying poise of a ghost reclaiming its throne. As she stood, her height seemed to change, her spine straightening into a line of pure steel. Juliana, still flushed with the heat of her own tantrum, took a half step back, her smirk faltering. She had expected to look down at a shattered girl. Instead, she found herself staring into eyes that were void of fear, void of sorrow, and filled with a predatory, ancient intelligence. Maya didn't brush the dust from her apron. She didn't look at the champagne stain on Juliana's dress. She looked directly into Juliana's soul, her gaze so heavy and piercing that the socialite's breath hitched in her throat. The mocking whispers of the inner circle died out, replaced by an uneasy, prickling silence. There was something wrong with this maid's eyes. They weren't the eyes of someone who lived in the basement. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the world burn and hadn't blinked. Juliana's hand trembled as she tried to regain her footing. What are you doing? I told you to beg. Don't you dare look at me like that. Her voice, once a sharp command, now had a thin, desperate edge of panic. Maya took one step forward. It was a small movement, but the crowd instinctively parted as if she were carrying a bared blade. She leaned in toward Juliana, her movement so predatory that the socialite froze, paralyzed by a primitive instinct for survival. Maya didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice. When she spoke, it was a low, melodic whisper that carried more weight than a scream. A crown made of glass is easily shattered, Juliana, Maya said, her voice smooth and devoid of any servant's inflection. But the floor you think I'm kneeling on? It's the only thing keeping you from the abyss. Juliana blinked, her mouth hanging open. The words were cryptic, a riddle that made no sense in the context of a gala, yet they sent a visible shiver down her spine. The maid stood there, drenched in the golden light of the chandeliers, and for a fleeting second, the simple gray uniform looked more like a shroud of mourning for everyone else in the room. What is that supposed to mean? One of the heirs barked, trying to break the spell of the moment, but his voice lacked conviction. Maya didn't answer. She simply turned her back on them, a gesture of such profound disrespect it was more shocking than a slap. She didn't run away. She walked toward the center of the hall, her gait rhythmic and confident, leaving the elite of the city standing among the broken glass, feeling suddenly, inexplicably like the ones who were small. While the chaos simmered in the ballroom, the air in the estate's private library was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the weight of a legacy built on blood. Dante sat behind a heavy oak desk, his face a mask of brooding intensity. Beside him, his most trusted advisor leaned over a map of the city's shipping docks, but their conversation wasn't about territory or logistics. It was about a ghost. 5 years today, Dante muttered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with a rare, suppressed reverence. He turned a heavy gold signet ring over in his hands, a ring that bore the crest of the syndicate's original bloodline. The night the Empress disappeared, the world went gray. We've spent half a decade pretending we're in control, but we're just children playing in a house she built. The advisor sighed, a sound of weary agreement. The Black Widow of the Mediterranean. They say she could dismantle a government with a single ledger and vanish before the ink was dry. No body was ever found, Dante. No trace of the millions she moved. Just an empty throne and a vacuum no one has been able to fill. Dante looked toward the closed library doors, his eyes unfocused. She wasn't just a leader, she was a ghost story the other families told their children to keep them in line. She moved through high society like a queen and through the slums like a shadow. She knew the names of every dockworker and the sins of every senator. If she were here, Juliana's father would be on his knees begging for a mercy he doesn't deserve, and I'd be nothing more than her sword. He stood up, pacing the length of the room. The legend of the legendary founder was the only thing that kept the syndicate's rivals at bay. The fear that she might one day return was a more effective weapon than any hitman. Rumors had placed her in Paris, in Tokyo, or at the bottom of the Atlantic. But Dante had his own theory. He believed she was somewhere close, watching, waiting for the precisely perfect moment to reclaim what was hers. They call her the ghost in the room, Dante whispered, a shiver of genuine awe tracing his spine. She used to say that the best way to see the truth was to become the background. To be the help, the driver, the one who cleans the mess. Because nobody looks at the person holding the mop. He checked his watch, a heavy gold piece that caught the dim light. The gala was in full swing, and he was expected to make an appearance. He straightened his tailored jacket, unaware that the very woman he was eulogizing was currently walking the halls of his own estate. He didn't know that the invisible maid who had just stared down a socialite was the same woman who had taught him how to hold a gun and how to hold his tongue. "Let's go," Dante said, his voice regaining its steel. "The vultures are waiting to see if I'm as strong as she was. Let's not keep them waiting." As he reached for the door handle, he had no idea that he was seconds away from a confrontation that would shatter his world more effectively than any bullet. He was looking for a legend in the history books, never dreaming she was currently collecting his trash. The library doors groaned open, and the silence of the inner sanctum was violated by the shrill, indignant voice of Juliana. She burst into the room, her hand gripped tightly around Maya's arm, dragging her forward with a strength fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. Behind her followed a small entourage of the city's elite, their faces twisted into masks of performative outrage, eager to witness the execution of character. "Dante! You won't believe the insolence!" Juliana cried, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. This creature. This maid. She tripped me, ruined my dress, and then had the audacity to threaten me. In your house, Dante. She's dangerous, or insane, or both. Maya didn't resist. She allowed herself to be pulled into the center of the room, her body limp but her head held with that same unsettling, quiet gravity. She looked like a lamb being brought to the slaughter, yet she was the only person in the room whose breathing remained rhythmic and slow. Dante was standing by the window, his back to the door, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. At the sound of the commotion, he didn't move immediately. He remained still, a dark pillar of power, his presence radiating an authority that usually quelled any room. She refused to apologize, one of the heirs added, stepping forward to gain favor. She looked at Juliana like she wanted to kill her. "You have to handle this, Dante. We can't have the help thinking there are equals." Dante let out a long, weary sigh. He was exhausted by the petty dramas of the wealthy, his mind still heavy with the ghost of the founder. He slowly began to turn, his expression one of bored irritation. "Is this truly how you spend your evening, Juliana? Policing the staff over a spilled drink?" "It wasn't just a drink." Juliana snapped, shoving Maya forward so that she stumbled slightly toward the desk. "She needs to be made an example of. Fire her. Throw her out into the street. Better yet, let your men show her what happens to people who forget their place." The music from the ballroom seemed to fade into a muffled, distant hum, swallowed by the thick stone walls of the library. The atmosphere in the room shifted, turning heavy and stagnant, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by a vacuum. Dante's gaze moved from Juliana's flushed, angry face down to the woman standing before him. Total silence descended. It wasn't the silence of a pause, it was the silence of a heart stopping. Maya stood there, framed by the shadows of the bookshelves, the golden light of the desk lamp catching the sharp line of her jaw. For the first time that night, she didn't look down. She didn't bow. She looked Dante directly in the eyes, her expression as calm as a frozen lake. Dante's hand, which had been reaching for a crystal decanter, froze midair. The boredom vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of such sheer, primal shock that Juliana actually stopped talking. His eyes widened, his pupils dilating until they were pools of black ink. The color drained from his skin, leaving him a ghastly, translucent gray. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stared at the clumsy maid, as if the floor had opened up to reveal the fires of hell. The world outside the room, the gala, the money, the power, ceased to exist. In that moment, there was only the man who thought he was a king, and the woman who knew he was just a steward. The silence in the room was no longer atmospheric, it was suffocating. Juliana, sensing the shift but misinterpreting the cause, smirked. She reached out to shove Maya's shoulder one last time. "Well? Don't just stand there staring, Dante. Teach her her place." As Juliana's hand made contact, Maya's sleeve shifted upward just a fraction of an inch. Under the harsh glow of the desk lamp, a mark was revealed on the inside of her wrist. It wasn't a common tattoo. It was a brand, a delicate, intricate crest of a weeping willow entwined with a serpent, etched in ink that seemed to shimmer with a faint, metallic sheen. Dante's breath didn't just hitch, it rattled in his chest as if his lungs had turned to lead. That mark was the heir's mark, a symbol that had not been seen in the flesh for 5 long, chaotic years. It was the seal of the true sovereign, the woman whose blood held the divine right to rule every shadow in the city. The crystal decanter Dante had been reaching for slipped from his nerveless fingers. It shattered against the floor, spraying amber liquid across the room, but the sound didn't break the spell. Dante didn't even blink. His legs, which had stood firm against rival cartels and federal raids, suddenly gave way. To the absolute horror of everyone in the room, the most feared man in the underworld didn't strike the maid. He didn't yell. Instead, with a heavy, hollow thud, Dante fell to his knees. The room gasped as one. Juliana took a stumbling step back, her face contorting in confusion. Dante? What are you doing? Get up. Why are you kneeling to this servant? Dante didn't hear her. He ignored the glass shards biting into his knees through his expensive suit. He bowed his head low, his forehead nearly touching the floor, his entire frame shaking with a terrifying, reverent tremors. Forgive me, Dante choked out, his voice a raw, broken whisper that sent a chill through the onlookers. I was blind. I was a fool to believe the world could ever be empty of you. Maya stood over him, her shadow stretching long and dark across the library floor. The clumsy posture was gone, replaced by a terrifying, effortless authority. She didn't tell him to rise. She simply looked down at the back of his neck with the detached gaze of a sculptor looking at a piece of clay. You've grown soft in my absence, Dante, she said, her voice like velvet stretched over a blade. You've allowed the vultures to feast at my table and the children to play with my crown. The guests were paralyzed. The woman they had mocked, the woman they had tripped and doused in wine, was currently receiving the ultimate tribute from the man who owned their lives. The power dynamic of the room hadn't just shifted, it had been incinerated. Juliana's face went from red to a sickly, translucent white as the weight of her mistake began to settle in her gut like cold lead. She hadn't just insulted a maid. She had spit in the face of the queen. Maya reached up and pulled the simple white maid's cap from her head, letting her dark hair fall in a sharp, elegant cascade that framed a face suddenly stripped of its subservient mask. The transformation was bone-chilling. The clumsy girl who had stumbled over a socialite's heel was gone, replaced by the woman who had once dictated the price of peace across 3 continents. She didn't need a gown or diamonds to command the room. Her presence was an atmospheric pressure that made it difficult for anyone else to draw a full breath. Dante remained kneeling, his head bowed as if he were waiting for the strike of an executioner's sword. Maya stepped around the broken glass, her movements silent and predatory, and sat on the edge of the heavy oak desk, the very seat of power Dante had occupied just moments ago. 5 years, Dante, she said, her voice dropping into a rich, melodic tone that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. The world thought I was dead, and I let them believe it. Peace is a luxury I could only afford from the shadows. She leaned forward, lifting Dante's chin with the tip of a single finger. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, frantic loyalty. You wonder why I came back as a servant, she continued, her gaze drifting toward the terrified guests frozen by the door. I didn't hide because I was afraid of our enemies. I hid because I wanted to see what happened to my empire when the sun went down. I wanted to see if the man I left in charge would remember the foundation we built, or if he would let the termites rot the wood. She looked at Juliana, who was trembling so violently she had to lean against a bookshelf for support. Maya's smile didn't reach her eyes. I've spent 3 months in this house, Dante. I've scrubbed your floors, served your drinks, and listened to the way your friends speak when they think no one important is listening. I've watched you allow these people to turn our legacy into a playground for the cruel and the vapid. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. She hadn't been hiding from a rival syndicate or a government sting. She had been conducting a silent audit of the soul. She had placed herself at the very bottom of the hierarchy to see who would lead with justice and who would rule with a boot. The Shadow Queen didn't vanish because she lost her power, Maya whispered, her voice echoing in the dead silence. She vanished to see who deserved to keep theirs. And tonight, as I knelt on that ballroom floor while your guests laughed at the dirt on my hands, I got my answer. Dante's voice was a ragged plea. Mistress. I didn't know. If I had seen you. If you had seen me, you would have been a loyal servant, she interrupted, her voice turning as cold as the marble floor. But a leader is defined by how he treats the people he doesn't have to fear. You failed, Dante. You let them turn my house into a circus. She stood up, and for the first time, she looked toward the door, her eyes locking onto the socialites who had mocked her. The truth was out, and it was far more terrifying than any lie. She wasn't back to hide, she was back to harvest. Maya walked toward the group of socialites with a slow, deliberate cadence that sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Juliana tried to shrink into the shadows of the bookshelves, but there was nowhere to hide from a woman who had spent months memorizing every one of her sins. Maya didn't reach for a weapon, she reached for a slim, encrypted tablet resting on Dante's desk. You told me earlier that your dress was worth more than my bloodline, Juliana, Maya said, her voice soft, almost conversational. Her thumbs moved across the screen with surgical precision. It's a beautiful piece. Silk from the Lombardy region, custom tailored. It's a shame that in approximately 30 seconds, the credit line used to purchase it, along with your father's primary holdings in the harbor, will cease to exist. Juliana's phone chimed in her clutch. Then it chimed again. And again. A frantic, rhythmic pulsing of notifications that mirrored her escalating heartbeat. She fumbled it open, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray as she stared at the red text flashing across her banking app, account terminated. Assets seized. What did you do? Juliana gasped, her voice cracking. I didn't do anything you didn't earn, Maya replied, turning her gaze to the heir who had ground his heel into her foot. And you, Marcus. You were so proud of your family's shipping merger. You should know that the silent partner holding 49% of your firm's debt isn't a bank in Switzerland. It's me. As of this moment, I am calling in the loan. Your offices are being padlocked as we speak. Marcus dropped his glass. The shatter was a pathetic echo of the one that had started the night. He checked his own phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. You can't do this. This is illegal. In your world, perhaps, Maya said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp brilliance. In mine, it's simply housekeeping. I've spent months listening to you all brag about the power you use to crush those beneath you. Tonight, you find out what it feels like to be beneath. One by one, she dismantled them. With a few taps, she revoked the social standing they had spent lifetimes building. She didn't use a single bullet, she used the very systems of greed they worshipped to erase them. She pulled the metaphorical rug from under the elite, watching with clinical detachment as they spiraled into a panic they couldn't buy their way out of. You called me invisible, Maya said, stepping into the center of the trembling circle. You were right. I saw everything. I saw the tax evasion in your father's ledgers, Marcus. I saw the bribes Juliana's family paid to the zoning board. I saw the rot in your souls while I was cleaning your messes. Now, the world is going to see it too. She turned back to Dante, who was still kneeling, his head bowed in shame. Take them out, she commanded. Remove their security clearance. Escort them to the gates. They came here as gods, but they will leave as the nobodies they always were. And Dante? Make sure they walk. I've already repossessed their cars. As the security team moved in, stripping the stunned socialites of their jewelry and phones as collateral, the room filled with the sounds of their sobbing and desperate pleas. Maya didn't look back. She simply picked up a fresh glass of water, her expression as serene as a summer morning. The great humbling wasn't a riot, it was an eviction. The heavy oak doors of the library swung open, and the chaos of the ballroom died a sudden, strangled death as Maya stepped back into the light. She no longer moved with the hurried, shuffling gait of a servant. Every step was measured, a rhythmic strike against the marble that echoed with the weight of an empire. The simple maid's uniform, once a badge of shame, now looked like a conqueror's armor, a skin she had outgrown and was ready to shed. 3 steps behind her followed Dante. The man who had entered the evening as the undisputed king of the city's underworld now walked with his eyes cast down, his hands clasped firmly in front of him. He didn't lead, he shadowed. He didn't protect, he served. To the stunned guests watching from the sidelines, the sight was more jarring than a declaration of war. The hierarchy of their world had been inverted in a single hour. Maya didn't stop to acknowledge the terrified whispers or the pale faces of the remaining guests. She walked through the center of the gala, a path clearing before her as if by divine command. As she reached the grand entrance, she paused, her hand resting on the cold brass of the door handle. She looked back one last time, not at the people, but at the house itself. "The house is clean now, Dante," she said, her voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "But the city is still filthy." "Your car is waiting, mistress," Dante replied, his voice a low, steady rumble of absolute submission. She stepped out into the cool night air, where a fleet of black SUVs sat idling, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of waiting predators. She didn't head toward the luxury sedan Dante had prepared for himself. Instead, she walked toward the lead vehicle, the one usually reserved for the vanguard. As she climbed into the back seat, the driver, a man who had served the syndicate for 20 years, didn't ask for a destination. He simply nodded, his hands trembling slightly on the wheel as he realized the legend had returned. Dante slid into the seat across from her, his posture rigid, waiting for the first order of the new era. Maya looked out the window as the estate faded into the distance. She pulled a small, worn notebook from her apron pocket, the same one she had used to keep track of floor waxing schedules. But as she flipped to the back, the pages were filled with names that had nothing to do with housekeeping. They were names of governors, judges, and rival bosses. "They think the cleaning is over," Maya whispered, her eyes reflecting the flickering streetlights. "But I haven't even reached the master bedroom yet. The city thinks it's safe because the party is over, but Maya's notebook has 3 more names crossed in red, and the next one is the man who thought he ordered her death 5 years ago. Now, I have a question for you. If you found out that nobody working for you was actually the person who owned your entire world, would you run, or would you beg? Let me know in the comments what you would do in Dante's shoes. This is just the beginning of the Queen's return. If you want to see exactly how she dismantles the corrupt governor in part 2, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to be the only one who misses the reckoning. See you in the next one.